This episode is sponsored by Masterclass. Though it is really important to know stuff, Masterclass's world-famous instructors show you how to do what's important to you. When I set out to prepare for this podcast almost exactly 1 year ago, I knew in April 2020 that I needed to get better at writing. That's where one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, came in. Masterclass makes it possible for me and others wanting to improve their writing to take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on writing at our own pace. You can watch, and in many cases listen to awesome instructors like Malcolm Gladwell teach you how to do what's important to you. You want to be a better cook? Gordon Ramsay teaches you how on the Masterclass platform. You want to learn how to act? Natalie Portman teaches you on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself and support Forgotten Wars by trying Masterclass for the year using the link in our show notes. Learn how to do what's important to you from the experts. Now, to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Lord Roberts in Pretoria and General Buller in Natal, and eventually the southeastern Transvaal, had wanted something for weeks: to unite their forces somewhere and finish the Boers off, at least in the Transvaal. Railways that Boer guerrillas had savaged all over the Transvaal, especially the railway linking Natal with Pretoria, suddenly had finally grown safer to repair as more Boers fled the field. Reopening these railway lines made Lord Roberts's supply lines much more speedy and sure. Not only that, General Buller and Lord Roberts met face-to-face in Pretoria on July 7th because of these newly repaired railway lines. The leader of the India Ring and the second in command in the Africa Ring acted civilly, but Lord Roberts couldn't have avoided looking with loathing on the man he believed responsible for his son Freddie's death. After Prinsloo and his 4,500 men laid down their arms by early August 1900, Buller's lines of communication with the Free State grew more secure. Lord Roberts and General Buller met again on August 25th at Belfast. Lord Roberts was about to direct a combined attack on Louis Botha's army. General Buller grumbled about how slowly Roberts had made his way over. Buller argued that he could have captured Creer's fleeing staff if Roberts hadn't made him wait around. Whatever the merit of Buller's complaints, the final chapter in the war's book of set-piece battles was about to end with the ongoing Battle of Bergendal.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Botha's approximately 7,000 men and 20 guns faced off against Roberts and his 19,000 men and 82 guns. Many skirmishes, occurring over the course of a week, composed this battle. The beginning of the end came when Buller decided that the key to Botha's 20-mile defense line lay in a big red kopje near a farm called Bergendal. Botha put 60 of his elite warriors inside this jumble of boulders to hold off the British. The 60 men were Zarps, members of the Johannesburg police, the infamous force that shot Tom Edgar and thus helped bring about the great Uitlander protests that brought on this South African War. The British brought down Armageddon on these boulders that Zarps held. These Zarps experienced more intense artillery fire than anyone in the war had, save for a few during the battles of Fall Crans and Peter's Heights. Pakenham writes, quote, "Down crashed the thunderstorm of lyddite on that single, isolated red knob of boulders, a 3-hour broadside of naval guns, howitzers, and field guns, 40 guns, grinding and hammering that strong point to powder, and the Zarps took it on the jaw like Tommies. No ordinary Dutchman would have held on like that," said General Littleton admiringly. "It must be a perfect inferno." Then Littleton sent 4 battalions of infantry to take the kopje. No bullets greeted these battalions at first. It seemed that the Zarps were crushed. Then, as infantrymen went over the skyline, the Zarps stopped holding their fire. They lit up the oncoming British with pom-pom and rifle fire. But the Zarps couldn't hold off the British. When the British finally burst into that sloppy ring of boulders, 14 Zarps lay dead, and 19 Zarps remained, 8 of them wounded. The other wounded Zarps had already been evacuated. Littleton swelled with pride in what his men had done. Why? The British taking this kopje set off a chain reaction. Without this kopje in hand, the Boer line was untenable, so the Boers retreated again. The British suffered almost 400 casualties during that week-long battle of Bergendal. The Boers suffered nearly 80. Afterwards, President Stein and his officials, along with President Creer and his officials, discussed what to do. What they did was throw Creer as a Hail Mary to Europe to get more foreign intervention. They also decided that the Transvaal forces needed to follow suit with their Free State brothers. No more set-piece battles. The Transvaal forces needed to dissolve into smaller guerrilla units from now on. Creer stepped aboard a Dutch cruiser in September to fulfill his mission to secure foreign help. Creer never saw South Africa again. He died in Switzerland in 1904. About 6 months after Creer sailed away to Europe, Jan Smuts wrote this reflection, quote, "As soon as we sent President Creer out of the country and his money-grabbing, traitorous hangers-on out of the way, the whole tone and aspect of things were altered for the better." End quote. Many other Boer leaders showed no sadness to see Creer leave, as they blamed Creer's greed and mediocre leadership for the struggling war effort. Steyn, on the other hand, fled back into the Free State. On September 13th, Lord Roberts declared war effectively over. Botha split his remaining men between himself and a remarkable man. General Benjamin Viljoen served competently and bravely throughout this Boer War, so much so that he eventually became Assistant Commandant General. One of the first Boers to use guerrilla warfare in the Transvaal, Viljoen evaded capture until January 1902. Shipped to St. Helena as a prisoner of war, he wrote his memoirs of the war in 1902. Now this is where it gets really interesting. After this war was over, Viljoen set up a Boer settlement in northern Mexico. Then he moved to La Mesa, New Mexico, and attained American citizenship. But before long, Viljoen was back in action in Mexico. Viljoen helped Francisco Madero overthrow Porfirio Diaz, a crummy dictator who'd ruled Mexico for 30 years. Viljoen returned to the U.S. in 1913 and died in La Mesa, New Mexico in 1917. So, back to our war. Botha and Viljoen ran different directions with their respective groups of warriors, trying to make their armies tougher to capture. But Botha had a problem. Nasson writes, quote, "Saddled with almost 3,000 unwarlike commandos and foreign volunteers who were desperate for a way out of continuing hostilities, Botha decently pushed them off towards Komatipoort, and a choice between being interned by the Portuguese colonial administration or being taken prisoner by the British. Irish and other foreign nationals were combed out and repatriated to Europe and America. Yes, you heard that right. There were several thousand foreigners who served in Boer ranks throughout the war. In addition to Irishmen and Germans and various Scandinavians and Americans you've heard about in previous episodes, there were also Australians, Italians, and Russians who took up arms for the Boers. That's not to say, though, that there weren't foreign volunteers fighting on the British side either. Anyway, Botha let hundreds of these volunteers walk away after Bergendal. Lord Roberts, on the other hand, proclaimed the annexation of the Transvaal in the last weekend of October. Then, in the last weekend of November, as mentioned in a prior episode, Lord Roberts left Lord Kitchener in charge of a war that Roberts kept saying was over. But was it? Another British man's star continued its ascent in October 1900. His escape, his heroics, his connections, and ultimately his book sales helped propel his star. Winston Churchill's book, From London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, and then his book, Ian Hamilton's March, sold very well after they were published in 1900. Winston would finally stash away thousands of pounds and finally afford to run for a seat in the House of Commons in the Oldham district. Salisbury, Chamberlain, Churchill, and company painted their liberal opposition as pro-Boer. For example, Chamberlain ran with the slogan, "Every seat lost to the Conservative government was a seat gained by the Boers." Churchill used the following slogan in one of his posters in Oldham: "Be it known that every vote given to the Radicals means 2 pats on the back for Creer and 2 smacks in the face for our country." Winston and the rest of the Conservative Party cruised to victory in these khaki elections across Great Britain, winning 2.4 million votes nationwide, compared to about 2 million votes for Liberals and their allies. So, about 4 million pats on the back for Creer, using Churchill's math. The Conservative majority in the House of Commons increased to 134 seats more than the seats held by Liberals and Irish nationalists. So the Conservative Party now had up to 6 more years to stay the course in South Africa. British MPs made no salary for serving in Parliament, so Winston knew he had to strike while the iron was hot. He spoke 29 times across Great Britain after the khaki elections. Then, if you disregard differences in time zones, Winston Churchill began his speaking tour in his mother's maiden country a year to the minute that he escaped his Praetorian POW camp. Winston began his American speaking tour around 8:30 p.m. on December 12, 1900, in New York City, by being introduced by Mark Twain. Mark Twain must have made Churchill a little nervous at first, by first voicing his opposition to the war in South Africa, as well as the United States war in the Philippines. Twain said the British and Americans were now kin in sin, and that his heart, for one, was with the Boers. But then, Twain warmly introduced Churchill as a great blend of America and England. Churchill started his speech with tales of South Africa nervously at first, but eventually spoke as smoothly as he had before in Britain. Churchill used humor effectively to ease tension at various stops on his American tour when pro-war groups, many Irish Americans, would jeer him. Churchill also made sure to voice respect for the Boers' courage and humanity. Churchill spoke much more freely in Canada, where far fewer pro-Boers raised their voices. Throughout October, the Boer guerrillas continued to strike supply columns, to attack isolated British contingents, to take small towns, and to strike British telegraph lines, thus forcing the British to rely more on more easily deciphered heliograph signaling. President Steyn met with Botha, Delaray, and Smuts in the end of October in a hideaway near Pretoria to plot strategy. They faced a growing scorched earth campaign and more of their women and children being swept into concentration camps. The scorched earth policy, by design, made it difficult for the Boers to replenish themselves if they continued to use hit-and-run tactics behind enemy lines. So what were they to do? Nasson writes, quote, "The only way to ease the pressure would be a strategic initiative to distract the British. The Boers hit on a fresh campaigning solution, almost a grand design. It was to carry the war on a guerrilla basis back into British territory." End quote. In Natal, in the Cape, you see, the Boer leaders knew that it would be politically difficult, perhaps politically suicidal, for the British to use scorched earth tactics against people who were technically on the British side. But before this dual colony strike, Smuts proposed a 3-step plan. First, Boer guerrillas would raise enough hell in the Boer republics to draw British forces away from Johannesburg. Step 2, after drawing those British away from Johannesburg, throw a 12,000-man Boer force, theoretically this large force would be lying in wait somewhere, into an attack on gold mines and on all mining property in the Witwatersrand. Step 3, taking advantage of the ensuing chaos resulting from this mine strike, Louis Botha would lead an invasion force into Natal, while De Wet and De la Rey would drive into the Cape Colony. Smuts argued that destroying the mines this time would be different, since the mines were now in British hands, since destroying these was not 1/10 as bad as the British farm burning and hurting of Boer families, and since destroying these mines could decisively change the future of the war. But De Wet didn't reach the assembled Boer leaders before. They intercepted a British telegram betraying plans to raid Coasters Valley. Ironically, intercepting a telegram threw their coordinated invasion plans into a trash heap. If you were ever caught napping while on watch duty in De Wet's commandos, you paid pretty severely. Imagine looking out for British for hours one night, or even one day, and waking up to be yelled at and told to go lie down. You pace as directed until you are told to stop. Then you're told to lie down. The problem is, you're being told to lie down in the middle of tiny hills teeming with ants. You lie down and the ants crawl all over you. Then, the ants begin to torture you. But you know that if you move, you will be shot. So you lay there suffering until your field cornet, commandant, or De Wet himself decide that you've learned your lesson. This ant heap punishment wasn't enough to keep men of De Wet's sentries from falling asleep or performing with gross incompetence. It wasn't enough to keep a 600-man British detachment from sneaking up on De Wet and Steen's 800-man commando 20 minutes after dawn. A sentry had just reported to De Wet that everything was fine when the British struck. Many burghers were literally asleep when the British struck. In the ensuing, humiliating chaos, De Wet tried desperately to beat his men into staying and not fleeing the scene. But as soon as he'd beat one group into staying, another out of his reach would flee. Major-General Charles main column moved too slowly to fully capitalize on this surprise. So Steen managed an escape, as did De Wet. But the commando's rear guard that made escape possible was trapped, 155 of them. 25 men in this rear guard lost their lives, and 30 sustained wounds, and 100 lost their freedom. But Steen and De Wet lived to fight another day. The British only suffered 38 casualties at Bothaville. But De Wet didn't stay down. On November 23rd, he attacked a British garrison at De Wetsdorp, his hometown. After 3 days of fierce fighting, the British garrison surrendered. De Wet continued on. There was no time for gloating for he or any other commandos who scored victories for that matter. The British grew more and more mobile, and better supplied, while the Boer warriors' resources and horses grew more scarce. De Wet caused enough chaos to draw enough British to make a way for General James Hertzog and General Piet Kirchner to lead 2,000 commandos across the Orange River into the Cape Colony on December 17th. Just a week before, Sir Alfred Milner saw Lord Roberts off while feeling that Lord Roberts was getting celebrated too much for a general who was leaving in the middle of a war. Also in December, De la Rey and Smuts combined their forces and attacked a lightly guarded British convoy outside Rustenburg. They bagged, wounded, or killed 120 British soldiers, flogged or executed 20 African drivers, torched 115 wagons, and carried off as much medical supplies, clothing, boots, and food as they could. Then, on December 13th, Nooitgendacht happened. In the Mahalisberg mountain range between Pretoria and Rustenburg, many Boers hid in ravines and used other cover and harassed British columns that marched through this mountain range by sniping those British columns. Just 10 days before, Coste-de-la-Rey had captured a British convoy at Buffels Poort. Now, Major General Ralph Clements and 1,500 troops, 9 guns, a pom-pom, and a huge bank of supplies sat at the southern base of the mountain. General Clements didn't take the known Boer threat in the area seriously, so he didn't gather basic intelligence or set up a strong picket line. That's an outer defensive line that can help warn the main force of an oncoming attack and help slow down an attack initially. Clements paid for this. De la Rey and General Christian Bayer's men would attack General Clements' force from the west. Commandants Jan Kemp and E. Marais would attack from the north. General Jan Smuts would cut off Clements' escape route from the southeast. At least that was the plan. The Boers struck at 3:45 a.m. Notice a common theme here? They successfully took the British position on the summit and fired down on Brits below the summit. But Smuts did not manage to take Valkop, the hill that was key to Clements' escape route. The Boer generals did not stay on the attack and press their numeric advantage or take advantage of the fact that the British had no trenches at their positions. Or, you could say that the Boer generals could not press their advantage. Many of their men had no interest in continuing the pursuit of Clements' force when food and loot lay in front of them. Instead, Clements managed to escape with about 800 men after 3 p.m. But the attack cost the British 640 casualties and the Boers less than 80 casualties. The Boers also bagged 120 mule carts and ox wagons filled with food and vital supplies to keep the Boer resistance around the Transvaal going. After less than a month of stepping into Lord Roberts's shoes, Lord Kitchener had another reminder that resistance in the Transvaal remained a real threat. As the 20th century turned, as more Boer women and children were swept into concentration camps, the Free Staters and Transvaalers still did not get on one coordinated page in 1901. That's not to say they didn't try. De Wet urged guerrilla leaders into a 4-pronged attack, but a 4-pronged attack that lacked many things, not the least of which were sufficient numbers. Beginning January 27th, De Wet headed south for the Cape Colony. De Wet hoped to unite and enforce some discipline over Boer forces operating in the Free State and Cape Afrikaners yet to rise up against the British. General James Hertzog was already leading an invasion of the Cape Colony, cutting westward across the colony's northern region beginning in mid-January. Hertzog hoped to open Lambert's Bay for a shipment of European munitions and maybe even more European volunteers. This hope turned out to be a fantasy. De Wet aimed to meet Hertzog's force and then march southwest towards Cape Town. Pete Kirtzener was leading a 1,000-man strong force as the third prong of his attack on the Cape Colony's Midlands, where he sought to harass loyalist blacks and whites and inspire more Afrikaners to join the struggle. Fourth, Louis Botha could lead 1,000 men into Natal to attack Dundee and snap the spine of the British supply network in the Transvaal. Kitchener showed no surprise, though, when he sent General French and 21,000 troops after Botha. French fired everything behind Botha and didn't hesitate to dynamite Botha's own house. Botha's force found fresh horses and food increasingly more scarce, and the British noose around their necks getting too thick to snap. What's more, at least 10,000 Asahai and rifle-wielding Zulu formed part of that noose, blocking any easy escape through Zululand. Not only did Botha get pushed back, but the British also shoved Hertzog and Kirtzener back towards the Orange Free State thanks to increasingly fleet-footed, mounted columns. The Boer guerrillas also could not have known that Hertzog and Kirtzener's drive into the Cape Colony was both what Sir Alfred Milner feared, but also, ironically, what he needed. Finally, Milner convinced the Cape Colony Prime Minister Gordon Sprigg, as well as the colony's general and state attorney, to resort to martial law and to call loyal colony inhabitants to arms. 10,000 militiamen came out of the Cape Colony's woodworks, and just like that, the Boer invasion fizzled. Milner proposed a plan first to Lord Roberts, then to Kitchener, that arguably made great sense. Pakenham explains the plan like this, quote, "It was a plan for the progressive reconquest of the two new colonies, the Free State and Transvaal, by a gradual securing of each district before tackling the next, and slowly occupying the country bit by bit, rather than rapidly and repeatedly scoring it." Milner believed, and Buller shared this view, that Roberts's fatal mistake had been his failure to garrison and police each district before marching on to the next one. What the bulk of the people in the new Orange River colony require is protection, not punishment, he told Kitchener in October. "I do not mean to say that they do not all hate us. They do. But they love their property more than they hate the British, and would be glad to see the back of the guerrillas." As well as being the most efficient way of ending the war, this system would have two other vital advantages. First, it would avoid the need to further devastate the country with all the legacy of bitterness that would create. Second, the key to the Transvaal was, of course, to get the wheels of the gold mines turning. And the moment Johannesburg was made a protected area, the mines could begin to reopen, and the Uitlanders, howling in the refugee camps of the Cape, could be allowed back up the railway to their homes in the Rand. End quote. Instead, Milner kept paying steeper and steeper costs, for Kitchener taking the complete opposite course. Milner also worried in February, when Kitchener looked like he might hammer out a negotiated peace with Botha that would help war leaders save face and develop a separate identity and political force after the war. Milner certainly wanted peace, but something closer to an unconditional surrender that would break Afrikanerdom in South Africa forever. How did the British try to get through to leaders of the Boer resistance? By enlisting prominent Boers who longed for peace and feared complete destruction of their people and land. Brilliant Boer leaders like Piet de Wet tried to get through, but ex-heroes like him got the cold shoulder at best from the Afrikaner Bond Party and from the prominent Dutch Reformed Church in the Cape. At worst, if these former Boer warriors reached their brothers still in the field, these former warriors forfeited much more. Jan Smuts was one of many resistance leaders who greeted these emissaries with court-martials and death sentences for being traitors. General Frudeman flew into a violent fit of rage, flogged, and then shot dead a peace emissary to de Wet's Lager. The secretary of the Burger Peace Committee, Mayor de Kock, faced execution for his efforts. So the British then sent people too frail or old to be brutally executed. Hendrina Joubert, the old widow of Piet Joubert, brought a written appeal to Botha that urged Botha and company to think of how helplessly outnumbered they were and to think of the women and children suffering while they fought on. Botha and A.H. Malan and other resistors pointed out the bitter irony that it was they, the progressives who had opposed the war as long as possible in the first place, who were fighting in the field while so many of the peace emissaries had been in Krier's warmongering party. But in late February, Annie Botha tried her hand at mediating peace talks again in February 1901. Kitchener told her everything except the annexation of the Boer republics was up for discussion. Kitchener anticipated discussing the following points with Botha. First, Kitchener wanted to confirm the inferior legal status of the black Africans. Second, Kitchener would offer to pay Boers for war damage. Third, he would reassure Boers that they would not be ruled by capitalists. Kitchener wrote on this point, quote, "They are, I believe, absurdly afraid of getting into the hands of certain Jews who no doubt wield great influence in their country." Kitchener here certainly was thinking of the Werner and Beit mining giants. Fourth, Kitchener was willing to offer amnesty even to Boers in Natal and Cape Colony who'd fought against the British. Kitchener and Botha did meet at Middelburg on the final day of February. Milner seriously disagreed with Kitchener about giving colonial rebels amnesty, but feared Kitchener's threat that our soldiers can't be trusted to not surrender on the smallest provocation, and that consequently disaster is not even now impossible if the Boers stick it out. Kitchener's 4 points transformed into 10 points, not too different from his original 4. One other that I'll mention is that Dutch and English languages were to be used in schools and courts moving forward. British cabinet accepted most of the points, but took Milner's side on the amnesty question. However, London disagreed with Milner and Kitchener's racially charged 10th point of the peace proposal. Quote, as regards the extension of the franchise to Kaffirs in the Transvaal and Orange River colony, it is not the intention of His Majesty's government to give such a franchise before a representative government is granted to those colonies. End quote. British cabinet, especially Chamberlain, argued that the peace proposal should guarantee similar legal and voting rights to blacks as the Cape Colony already was. You'll recall very few blacks and coloreds had the vote in the Cape Colony, but much more than 0. Chamberlain wrote, quote, we cannot consent to purchase a shameful peace by leaving the colored population in the position in which they stood before the war, with not even ordinary civil rights which the government of the Cape Colony has long conceded them. End quote. They passed on these modified peace terms to Botha on March 7th. But just as Kitchener feared, Botha rejected the modified peace terms days later. Botha would not accept anything less than independent Boer republics. Kitchener was frustrated. He'd had his successes, but Clement's failure at Nooit-Gendacht on December 13th, General Viljoen's successful surprise attack and bagging of over 200 British POWs at Helvetia on December 29th, De Wet failing to gain any Cape Afrikaner recruits, but succeeding in breaking back into the Orange Free State, and now Botha rebuffing a peace offer that Kitchener would have preferred to be more generous. All of this frustrated Kitchener. Kitchener's field intelligence told him that 20,000 Boer warriors still remained spread across the field. Kitchener's 200,000 forces were bagging about 1,000 Boer warriors a month. At that rate, the war wouldn't be over until at least October 1902. The country was just too big, too spacious, too easy for Boers to escape capture in, even if they were outnumbered 10-1. Broderick, the Secretary of State for War and Cabinet, urged Kitchener to keep the waging of war as efficient as possible. Kitchener already carried a strong reputation for performing wars on the cheap. But this war had already cost far more than they originally projected, even before Kitchener took charge. This desire to wage war on the cheap partially explains why Kitchener and company didn't care too much about properly feeding and supplying the inmates at their concentration camps. One official estimate placed the cost for killing each Boer warrior in 1901 at 140 pounds. That was the cost of a literal ton of bullets. In Kitchener's mind, something had to change. Kitchener decided to double down. No, to systematize something that was being done on a small scale across South Africa. If Kitchener couldn't get Botha or other Boer leaders to agree to peace, Kitchener would have to herd these guerrillas. But how? By using two of the most modern innovations at his time. Wait for it, barbed wire and blockhouses. Kitchener at first authorized blockhouses to be built at railway stations and train bridges to help protect those links in their supply lines. Major General Elliot Wood designed these blockhouses to be built using corrugated iron or stone and cement. Originally, these four-sided structures could stand at 2 to 3 stories high, with a couple lines of openings to allow defenders to fire on anyone attacking the blockhouse. Then, trenches were dug about 4 feet deep around these blockhouses to provide an additional layer of protection. General Wood's blockhouses took another 3 months to build. This would not do. Major S.R. Rice designed simpler blockhouses with 2 rows of corrugated iron filled with gravel. They came in octagonal or circular shapes. Sometimes a really small version of Major Rice's were mounted onto wagons, thus making a mobile mini-fortress. Think of a very primitive precursor to a tank. So where did barbed wire come in? Barbed wire with alarm rifles, bells, or empty tins formed an additional barricade outside the trenches. The idea that came to Kitchener was this: why not leave permanent structures all over South Africa to help funnel Boer guerrillas into zones where they'd be more easily captured? Then connect these permanent structures with barbed wire barricades. But this idea would cost money. By the war's end, 8,000 blockhouses dotted South Africa, covering over 3,700 miles. That is a lot of barbed wire. To put that in perspective, a bird would only have to fly about 2,800 miles from the continental United States' easternmost point to its westernmost point. The United Kingdom is only 600 miles from north to south. The British erected these blockhouses in zigzagging lines. For each blockhouse and corresponding trench and fieldworks, the British stationed somewhere between 12 and over 30 men, depending on the blockhouse type and whether the blockhouse was multi-story. So around 60,000 British forces manned this blockhouse system. That doesn't account either for the 3 or 4 black or colored guards that beefed up security at some of the blockhouses. Pretorius estimates that at least 25,000 blacks and coloreds served in these roles. Just building this system of blockhouses cost the British £1 million. But building a blockhouse system didn't even amount to 1% of the total cost of this war to the British. What did Boers think of this blockhouse system? It depends on who you asked. Christian de Wet broke through these blockhouse lines on more than one occasion and didn't find the blockhouse system insurmountable. Well, maybe that says more about the spirit of Christian de Wet and many other bitter enders. Louis Botha said that this blockhouse system weighed heavily on Boer morale because of how much it restricted their movement. Many Boer guerrillas must have felt more and more like starving, caged animals as this system forced them to fight in zones more easily controlled by the British, and made it harder and harder to perform hit and runs on formerly easy targets. So how would the Boer guerrillas respond in real time to this blockhouse system and to the knowledge that thousands and thousands of their women and children were suffering in British concentration camps? Tune in next episode. All right, just a reminder for you to continue sending me your questions that you have about these wars or related topics that we've covered in these past more than 40 episodes now. The more questions that I get, the more likely that I will produce a question and answer episode. Also, I would encourage you to tag me in any social media posts where you share podcast episodes. If you do, I'll be able to enter you into an ongoing contest that will end in September.